Does the moving on from Deebo Samuel signal a bigger change coming to the San Francisco 49ers? Tim Kawakami says it does. Plus, what do the 49ers do with Jordan Mason? And what do they do with the now $25 million extra dollars they're going to have in salary cap room? We'll talk about it all on today's Gold Standard Podcast. What is good, everybody? Welcome to another Gold Standard podcast on the Gold Standard and the Fans First Sports Network. I'm Rob Stats Guerrera here with a very special guest, formerly of the 49ers Web Zone podcast, formerly of KMBR, Al Sacco in the house. What's up, Al?
Stats, how you doing, buddy? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing well. Thanks for hopping in on very short notice, I might add. I do appreciate it on this Thursday. Got a lot to break down. Tim Kawakami came out with an article in the San Francisco Standard that I thought was very interesting for a couple of different points. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about Jordan Mason. I want to talk about the salary cap news that we got. A lot of stuff going on as we steamroll into the combine next week. Let's start with the article from Tim Kawakami.
Yeah.
A couple different things stuck out to me. First, I'm going to throw this quote up here. If you're watching on the stream, you can see what it says. Quote, "This is very much not 2021 or even 2023 anymore. And it's time for everybody in the locker room and throughout the organization to understand that behavior or slumps that were accepted when the 49ers were competing for conference championships are not looked on kindly now that the Niners are coming off a 6-11 season." Translation, Al, now they're really mad.
You know, it's crazy. When you look at this offseason stats, they had three players and major players, maybe Hall of Fame players in Kittle and Williams, and you can even say with McCaffrey, but older players, all of whom, I'm sorry, not Kittle, Ayuk, all of whom had contracts and all of whom wanted to redo their contracts. There were contract issues with all of them. Now, McCaffrey's was pretty quiet. They got it done early, but Williams and Ayuk obviously went on and almost into the season. Every single one of those blew up in their face. So with McCaffrey, if you go back to when he was with the Panthers, he had a 400 touch season. Oh God, it might've been 2019, but after he had that 400 touch season, he played 10 games the next 2 years. He's coming off a 400 touch season. The Niners give him that extension and he plays 4 games this season, really 3 games and a quarter. Trent Williams has a contract, wants more money, and Trent Williams is going to the Hall of Fame. Gets hurt. He's getting older. That blew up in their face. And Ayuk had been very durable. So you weren't expecting him to get injured this season, but they go to the end with him. The Niners did not want to pay him that money. They do. He has a major injury. And we may not even see him until maybe Thanksgiving. Who knows?
Yep.
And now you have 3 of these things that I'm sure Kyle and John went to bat and they're going to ownership and saying, hey, we need these guys. We have to pay these guys. 2 of them are older and Ayuk. All blew up in your face. So if I'm ownership and I paid out all this money, how are you happy right now? And I don't mean unhappy in the sense where somebody's going to get fired. Not right now. Maybe if there's another bad season, people are on the hot seat. But ownership cannot be happy shelling out millions and millions and millions of dollars. And all 3 of those contracts blew up in their face. And they paid Bosa more than they wanted to. I know that didn't sit well with the Niners. I mean, Bosa's making quarterback money. And again, if they wanted to give him that contract, they would have done it earlier. These contracts are lingering till the start of the season. It's affecting these players in season. And it gets swept under the rug when you win. But when you have a 6-11 season like they just did, a really bad season, it's going to come to light. And I feel like that's sort of where they are. And the Niners do have to look in the mirror, Kyle Shanahan, John Lynch, and ownership and say, okay, are we doing the right things here? Did we do the right things? Are we maybe a year late now in saying we're going to take a hard line? But that's where they are.
That's my frustration is like, oh, now you're not going to tolerate guys slumping and guys not working hard. And like what we have all been screaming about this for years. And you're right about the Ayuk situation, by the way. Kawakami writes in this article, I know there's still frustration about the way Ayuk handled his bitter negotiations last summer and that members of the front office were never thrilled about giving him a $30 million a year deal on the eve of the regular season. That's crazy to me, Al. First of all, the Niners have nobody to blame but themselves for these contracts. You dragged your feet and didn't get these done early. They would have been cheaper if you had gotten them done earlier, first of all. Second of all, if you didn't want to pay Brandon Ayuk, don't pay him. Like, what are we talking about here? You can't be mad about paying out these contracts. If you didn't want to do it, Jed York, don't do it. You decided to do it. You decided to listen to Kyle or whoever. So, like, you've got no one to blame but yourselves.
And I feel like, again, when you're coming off those seasons where you're in the Super Bowl, when we're in the NFC Championship game, you can go to ownership and say, listen, we need these guys. We're going to run it back again. But they ran it back again, and they ran it back again, and they ran it back again. And now they got old stats. They're getting old. And not only that, if you look at, if you follow me on any social media, you know I've been harping on this. 2021, 2022, 2023 drafts were atrocious. They were draft level of what you saw after the Harbaugh years when the roster fell apart. It's kind of the same thing. And you're seeing that now. The stars are still there, but the role players, and as you lose these stars, they're really hard to replace. And you look at what they did with the defensive line. So they've drafted 4 defensive linemen since 2020: Kinlaw, Jackson, Kalia Davis, and Beal. 2 of those guys are late round picks. You don't expect much of them, but Kinlaw and Jackson, you do in the first and the second round. You whiff on those guys, it becomes a snowball effect. You got to sign Javon Hargrave. He doesn't work out. You got to trade for Chase Young. He doesn't work out. And then what they did this past offseason was a Band-Aid approach to the defensive line, which is what you don't do to build a team. You sign Elliott, you trade for Collins, you sign Floyd, you try Gross Matos. Those guys, a lot of those guys probably aren't going to be here this year. And at most, you're going to get 2 years out of them. And you had one of the worst defensive seasons you've had in the last decade. Well, it was since 2016. So it didn't work out. They have to get back to getting better to draft and developing. But again, they have to look in the mirror and say, okay, what we've done lately hasn't worked. And the way we've drafted hasn't worked. And there should be some hard conversations, and there should be some accountability after a season like you just had.
And that's exactly how Tim starts the article. He says, moving on from Deebo is the first concrete evidence of a different kind of attitude around the team headquarters heading into the most meaningful parts of the 2025 offseason. And Tim even goes on in this article to talk about sort of the next phase of the 49ers. And he mentions how Kyle asked Brock Purdy and deommodore Lenoir to speak to the team last year, and how that is sort of, the next wave for the 49ers. He says, though Fred Warner and George Kittle still have the voices that mean the most in the locker room, the leadership shift is happening. And I think that is a good thing, Al, for this team. That is exactly what they need. They need to transition and recognize that it's not 2019 anymore, that we're in a new era. You missed it with this first. You couldn't get it done, but it's over. Now you have to build and transition into something new. And it is encouraging to me that they seem to recognize that.
I'll ask you this, Stats. So when you look at the 49ers, why were they the 49ers? They were because of blue chip guys, right? You had Kittle, Warner, Bosa, Armstead, Deebo in his heyday, McCaffrey, Greenlaw. I mean, I can go on and on. They have maybe 9 or 10 guys that you could say are blue chip-ish. When you talk about that next window and the next group of leaders and everything like that, as these blue chip guys age out or leave, there's no Armstead now, there's no Deebo, they're very difficult to replace. Do you think the 49ers have done a good job replacing these guys, or are you worried in the sense that, okay, as we move to this next window, it's kind of mid? They're going from maybe being a perennial Super Bowl team to you're an 8-win team, maybe you have a season with 10 wins. Do you see it that way, or am I being a little bit too hard on them?
I think if you're expecting them to build the talent level back up to like 2019 or 2023, that era, I don't know that we'll ever see a 49ers team that talented.
Yeah, I agree.
An absurd collection of talent. But as we have seen, you can still win the Super Bowl without that much talent. So, yeah, I don't know that we'll ever get to that level. I mean, they had incredible players. They had all-pro players at every level.
Everywhere.
They had all-pro players at everywhere on the offensive side of the ball. They were the first team ever to have an all-pro wide receiver, an all-pro running back, and an all-pro tight end at the same time. Like, that's an incredible level of talent. To expect that, I think, is maybe unrealistic. But you have Brock Purdy, which is a quarterback that they believe in, very young. You have Brandon Ayuk was supposed to be. Now, the injury throws a wrench into that, but he was, supposed to be part of that next young core group of players. You have Dominic Pooney on the offensive line. You have deommodore Lenoir. I know that Bosa and Warner are getting older, but they're not old yet. So like there were still plenty of pieces to be able to transition into that next phase. The key, as always, is the draft. And what has crushed the Niners, as you have said, is not just that they've had bad draft classes. Every team has bad draft classes, but to have 2 in a row is incredibly damaging. And we're talking draft classes where you get basically nothing.
Right.
That is incredibly damaging. If you have a bad draft class and then your next one is mid and then your next one is maybe good, like you can survive that. But when the 49ers miss on draft picks, they miss completely and they get nothing from them. And that is the effects that they're feeling right now.
Yeah, and you saw it with the injuries this year. They just didn't have the depth. They didn't have the guys. And as these other players move on, there's really not people to replace them. You hope Pearsall played really well at the end of last season, those last few games or whatever. So that is encouraging. Juwan Jennings had a terrific season. Now they need speed at wide receiver, but if IU can get back at the end of the season and they'll add a vet, that's encouraging. I still think George Kittle is still George Kittle. They do need another running back because I don't think you can rely on McCaffrey. I think anything you get from McCaffrey has to be a plus. You just can't figure, okay, he's going to come off this major injury at 29 and be a 350 touch guy, a 400 touch guy. I just don't think that's realistic. And this is a good draft for running. It's a really good draft for running backs to get people. So yeah, I mean, there's still talent there on the offensive side. There's some holes to plug on the line. They need a center, but defense is where I'm worried about. I'm really worried about the defense because, yeah, they have some stars there. Bosa's a star. Warner's a star. I think Lenoir is turning into a star. Couple young players you like in Green and Mustafa. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I named 5 dudes. Who else is even a starter for sure? It's really hard to, especially on the defensive line. I think Collins will still be around and he'll probably start. Do they bring back Leonard Floyd for a year? I don't know. But again, this wasn't a great defensive line last year. They need to replace it again. If Greenlaw doesn't come back, that's a huge hole. They suffered at that second linebacker position this year. They've taken 9 corners in the draft since 2021. I'm sorry, 9 secondary players, I should say, since 2021. You still need a safety if you don't believe in Jair Brown. And I'd be surprised. They may say that they do, but other than a backup, I'm not sure. And you need another corner. You probably need 2 corners for depth. So there's just so much they still need on the defensive side. And yeah, having Robert Saleh back is great, but you still need players. And they have a lot of work to do there, a lot of work.
Yeah, their defense has the most holes, I think, in it by far. I want to get to that in a second, but you mentioned the running back position. The Niners have an interesting choice to make with Jordan Mason. He's a restricted free agent. So that gives the 49ers some options. You can tender him at the first round level, and then you'd have to pay him basically $7.5 million. You could tender him at the second round level and pay him $5.3, or you could just do like a right of first refusal tender at $3.2 million. Now, just for context, most guys, I think there's only 26 running backs in the NFL that make $3 million or more per year. So that's high for a running back. And if you're wondering, Jordan Mason played for less than $1 million last year. Mm-hmm. So if I make you John Lynch, Al, or Kyle, I make you Kyle Shanahan, since it's ultimately Kyle's call anyway. Yeah. What tender are you putting on Jordan Mason? Are you putting a tender on him at all?
I know the fans like him, and I do too, but I probably wouldn't, again, because I think the draft is so good at running back. And I think Jordan Mason, to me, in the way the Niners have used, I don't think he's ever going to be the replacement to McCaffrey. Would he be part of a combination of a running back? Sure. A work share or whatever, but I don't ever think he's going to be like, all right, he's our dude. I think the Niners have to find that next dude in the draft. And I think that there's a lot of guys that they can do that with. So that is what I would do with them. You're still going to have Grendo there, although Grendo was always hurt. I feel like, again, he's just a few carry a game guy. I don't think he's anybody you can really rely on. So, it doesn't sound like those are big numbers, but when the Niners have to pay all the people they have to pay and they have all the free agents that they have and all the positions that they need to fill, $3.2 million, $5 million, that is kind of a lot. So if I'm them, maybe I am moving on there with, again, the expectation that we're going to get a guy in the draft that we're going to move forward with. Now, having said that, when you look at the running backs that Kyle's taken in the draft high, Williams, TDP, Trey Sermon, it hasn't been pretty. So when I say that, I mean, I understand why people would say, hey, wait, I'll pump the brakes. It's been ugly with who he's taken, but this is the draft to get a running back or 2 that are going to help you for the foreseeable future. It is so deep and good at running back.
As a team, I feel like you have to take advantage of the strengths of your personnel, and that includes coaches. And we've seen the 49ers be able to take running backs, either not drafted at all or free agent running backs, and turn them into productive players. I mean, Raheem Mostert was a journeyman. It was bouncing around the league. Jordan Mason, undrafted free agent. Stop drafting running backs in the 3rd round when you find guys that are more productive later. Use that strength that you have. Maybe it's all Bobby Turner, whatever it is. Use that to your advantage so that you don't have to spend a draft pick on a running back, and find the guys that are undrafted that you can make it work with. And then you get the benefit of both. You get the great running back, and hopefully you get somebody good with the 3rd round pick. I think the 49ers need to do that. Thanks for everything, Jordan Mason. Goodbye. I'm not paying you $3 million when I could pay an undrafted running back for similar production. And let's be honest, if Christian McCaffrey is there, how many carries are they going to give the other guy? I mean, they don't ever give 23 a break anyway.
Kyle will use, whether he should or shouldn't, Kyle will use him until he can't use him anymore. McCaffrey is going to be on the field.
Yep, till the wheels fall off, which may happen this year.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in agreement with you on the Jordan Mason thing. I like him. I loved watching him play. I love the power and the attitude. But anytime he was asked to be the main guy, he broke down pretty much immediately. And he's just going to be too expensive. And, sorry, like, you cannot get attached to these guys. You have to look at them like pieces of part of a machine. I know it sounds horrible, but we're just talking about roster construction here.
Right.
Okay? You have to look at them that way.
Well, listen, look at the way Bill Walsh approached things. Look at the way Bill Belichick approached things. It's better to get rid of these guys a year early than a year late. I mean, Jerry Rice didn't finish his career with the 49ers. Ronnie Lott didn't. Joe Montana did it. The list goes on and on. Yep. So I know everybody wants to think like, oh, it's kumbaya and these guys are going to play until they're 35 and retire 49ers. It's not the way the business works. And in the NFL, you could fall off quick. When you get, in around 30 years old or so, like, the wheels can come off pretty quickly. So I think you saw a little bit of that this season. And the Niners also, they played 3 really long seasons. They played 3 years in a row. It was 60 total games, I think. That takes its toll, especially when you have older players. So they have to get younger, they have to get faster, and they have to find guys that are going to be core players in this next window.
They have to. Will they? We'll see.
Yeah,
Oscar says Jordan Mason was leading the league in rushing last year. Absolutely he was, Oscar. And then what happened? He got hurt.
He was not a big factor in the passing game. And it's not that Jordan Mason is a good player. He runs hard. I think he's a terrific player. Running backs, by and large, are a dime a dozen. They are. And I know we've seen it's been a little bit of a renaissance with running backs lately, with McCaffrey a couple of years ago and Barkley and Jacobs, and what we've seen with some of these guys have been able to do, and those top end guys for sure. But there's also a lot of guys you can plug and play. Look at somebody like Chuba Hubbard from Carolina. I mean, you could find these running backs in a lot of different places. And I think especially on a team like the Niners in this scheme, there's a lot of dudes that could fit in that would give you the production that Mason did.
Yeah, this comment, Ahmad Z says the running back is the thing in the NFL now. Go watch Philly. Well, you want to know why Philly was so good? Because their offensive line was maulers. And I'm not trying to take away anything from Saquon Barkley. My point is, when you've got an offensive line like Philly, you can do the things that they did. And the 49ers already have their Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey. So the answer is not a different running back. The answer is the offensive line and getting better production than you got out of Aaron freaking Banks and Jake Brendel last season.
Yeah, that Philly team, the offensive line and the defensive line, they had 6 dudes on the defensive line that they drafted since 2021. All of them made a big impact in that Super Bowl run. So it's investing in the trenches defensively and offensively, and you can do a lot with your game, your running game, your pass rush, whatever, when you can own those trenches.
George Kittle just did an interview with USA Today Sports, and they asked him, where do you want the Niners to draft? That's exactly what he said. Offensive line, defensive line. He said, look at the Super Bowl. Like, the Eagles dominated across both of those fronts, and they crushed the Chiefs. And they're like, the Chiefs, the back-to-back Super Bowl champion, they humiliated the Chiefs in the game. It was 34-0 in the third quarter. It was an embarrassment. That's what they need to do. And they've got the opportunity. Now, what do they have? 11 draft picks, 10 draft picks? Like,
something like that.
Yeah. Give me 3 offensive line or 3 defensive linemen. Give me a couple offensive linemen. If you want to throw a wide receiver in there late, I get it. I think they're going to need to add a couple of wide receivers this offseason. But they have plenty of picks to address their needs.
Yeah, this is a draft, again, I said running backs, defensive line too. It's so deep. I mean, you could get impact guys into the 6th, 7th round. I feel like there's just so many names. it's a draft where they have to come away. I don't care what they do in free agency. They still have to come away with 2 or 3 defensive linemen out of this draft. They have to come away with a couple offensive linemen. They have to come away with a running back. There's a lot of positions that they need to go. I mean, we'll see what happens in free agency. I feel like they're gonna go after that center because Kyle's not gonna start a rookie center. I would be absolutely shocked. So they're gonna try to find a vet center somewhere. And they have to, if they don't get Greenlaw back, they have to replace Greenlaw. I know an off-the-ball linebacker, you're kind of like, but that was a huge issue last year with Campbell being there because he was horrible and he got picked on. You saw in the Super Bowl when Greenlaw went out. I know Burks played better for the Eagles this year, but Kansas City, they went from doing nothing on offense and Greenlaw goes out and they're going up and down the field. So Niners need to fill that second linebacker spot too, whether it's Sherwood, I think from the Jets, his name is. Yep. Somebody like that comes over from Salah. We'll see, but they have to fill these holes. They have to get after it, and they have to really hit on this draft in a lot of different spots.
Do you think that Robert Saleh can squeeze a little more juice from the D Winters orange, and that D Winters could possibly be a viable replacement for Dre Greenlaw?
I think he's certainly talented. From what I saw, the missed tackles and things like that. I don't know, man. Dre Greenlaw is a top 10 dude to me when he's on. So he's somebody like you said, we're probably, are you going to replace him? Probably not. You have to get someone who's at least not going to hurt you like Campbell did. You know what I mean? You want to get a good player in there. I don't think you can get another Greenlaw. So I don't think Winters is ever going to be on that level. I think you have to go into the season saying, all right, Winters is kind of our third guy. We need to find that second guy. Because the Niners, again, part of the reason they were so successful with the defense, they had the defensive line, but you have Warner and Greenlaw flying all over the place. You take away the middle of the field, they're going sideline to sideline. That's made a huge impact. So they have to get better there. And I like Winters, but I don't like Winters as a linebacker 2 type dude.
I would love to see it because I think if the 49ers could solve at least one need on both sides of the ball, if they could solve one need internally, it would be massive. It would give them so much flexibility, right?
Yeah.
If, for example, we had gotten to see more of Ben Barch last year, and they were like, you know what? Maybe Ben Barch could be our left guard for a year or two.
Yep.
He can be good enough for us at left guard to where, oh my God, we're not desperately trying to scramble to find a guy. Or if they thought like, hey, D Winters could be good enough for us at linebacker. Then when it comes to free agency, and especially when it comes to the draft, you have the flexibility to see who falls to you and just take a really good player without freaking out about having to fill needs.
Yeah, and as I look up and down the roster, there aren't many guys that I guess I'm hopeful for that. I like Evan Anderson a lot. I really like him on the defensive line. Yep. Maybe he's somebody that could step up in year 2 that you're like, okay, all right, well, now he's a good piece. But there's just, as I look up and down the roster, it's like, if you get it, it's a huge plus. And I guess it would be a surprise.
Yeah.
But there aren't a lot of guys where you're like, all right, next man up. Like sort of like with DJ Jones, where they kind of groomed him for a couple of years or whatever. And then all of a sudden, boom, like he's ready to go type thing. And I just don't see that right now. I'm really down on what the Niners have done the past 3. This past draft was better, but the past 3 of the last 4 years, I really think that they put themselves in a rough spot, and you're starting to see it right now. They have a ton of work to do. If you're listening to the show, I want you to take off your fan glasses and go through their roster and legitimately look at each position, especially on defense, and be like, are we good here? On defense, like I said, I think you got 5 guys you can count on. And other than that, you're like, we don't know. We have to fill these holes. We have to bring more dudes in. And that's a little bit scary. We always want to talk about Super Bowl with the 49ers, but the way the roster is constructed right now, I hope they can fight for a playoff spot.
I've said for years, if you get into the playoffs, the season starts anew. Like anything can happen. And say what you want about Kyle Shanahan. He's excellent in the playoffs. His playoff record proves it. I know. Yeah. I know they haven't won the Super Bowl, but he wins in the playoffs. He was the first coach ever to win multiple playoff games in each of his first 3 playoff appearances. And in fact, he's done it every single time his team has gotten to the playoffs. Yeah. So the attitude, I think especially like 2022, 2023, we were like, hey, Super Bowl, we got the best team. It's in the Super Bowl. Now the way I look at it with the 49ers, just get in and let's see what they got as good a chance as anybody. That would be my argument.
In 2021 is a good example of that because they had no business, to me, making the NFC Championship game in that season. And you look at the playoffs, Jimmy was throwing for $120 that year, and they win. they win ugly games against Dallas. They go into Green Bay with a block kick and they win. And they should have beat the Rams that year. And yeah, for some reason, when they get into January, they find ways to win. And even, and I do want to ask you a question about Brock Purdy, but we talk about Purdy struggled at the end of games last season. Well, twice in the playoffs, they looked awful and they came back to beat the Packers and the Lions. Something with that team just clicks when they're in the playoffs. But I haven't talked to you about this. And I know, seen you say some things about Purdy where I get the impression, and we haven't talked about it, but you're not totally sold there. Am I right or wrong based on?
I think we know what Brock Purdy is at this point.
Okay. I think that's fair.
Yeah. He's not one of the elite guys. Now I have to admit that I was staunchly against paying Brock Purdy. And then I talked to my friend RJ Ochoa from Blogging the Boys, and he sort of reminded me that even the teams that have given out the big quarterback contracts have been able to get out of it. For example, the Eagles got out of the Carson Wentz deal.
Yeah.
The Rams got out of the Jared Goff deal. Even the Broncos, who couldn't even find a trade partner for Russell Wilson, cut him and then made the playoffs last year. So it hasn't been like this devastating thing. And I didn't really realize it until he crystallized it like that for me. So I'm more warming to the Brock Purdy contract. But like, I think that Brock we know who he is. He's good, can be really good with people around him, but not great. Can make a really crippling, boneheaded turnover at times.
Yeah.
And can't play in the rain. Like, can't play in the elements. Is not good in the elements at all. And I think that's who he is.
I think that's a really fair way to put it. And I'm the same way with you. I think he's a good quarterback who's capable of what we saw 2 years ago, is a high-end type season when you have a lot of good things around him that can work. What worried me about him, I think this year, I think his shoulder was hurt towards the end. I do. Yeah. I think that affected, because he's been very good with deep passes. He has some of the best deep pass numbers in the league, and that didn't really seem to be there towards the end of the year. So I think that shoulder was bugging him. Having said that, that does not excuse the bonehead interceptions late in games, like you said. And those interceptions weren't like, oh man, we tried to get it there. He normally could get it there. Maybe his arm's bugging him. It was like, I'm throwing to this dude. He's sitting in the middle of the field and I'm just throwing it right to him. Like, head scratching, what the hell are you doing type picks. That worries me a lot, because I didn't think that was in him based on what I saw in the playoffs, where you have a game against Green Bay where he just was terrible. And then last drive, he's like, you know what, I'm winning this game. And he was terrific on that last drive to beat Green Bay. And the same thing against, you get in the NFC Championship game and you're getting your ass handed to you at halftime, and you come back. Quarterback's a huge part of that. He used his legs. I thought he had the moxie. And then this year I was like, bro, what are you doing with some of these picks? So I am worried about that, but I agree with you. They're not going to put themselves in a situation with the contract where they're like, oh my God, we're stuck with this guy for 5 years. We're in salary cap hell. They're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. So they'll be in a position where they can get out of it. And I think Purdy is a good quarterback, and good quarterbacks are hard to come guy. You just don't get rid of him and trade him and be like, oh, we'll figure it out, because there's nobody. Where are you going to go? So I do think it's worth signing him, and they won't be crippled by it.
Yeah, I don't expect like Brock Purdy to elevate his level of performance beyond what we've already seen, but I'm also now comfortable with, okay, if you pay him, it's not like, well, you set us back for a half a decade. I don't think that's what it's going to be either. And Brock does a lot of things that I really like. Number one, we know he's a hard worker, right? He's not going to Garoppolo you in the offseason and just disappear. He's an active guy. He's a guy that's going to work with teammates. I love all of that. I love Brock Purdy from the neck up, honestly. Like, his processing, most of his decision makings. Every quarterback makes some bad decisions once in a while. Most of it's good. I think he's actually learning, like, hey, you know what? It's probably better if I take off and run as opposed to go to read number 4 on a particular play. Like, I think that he'll grow into that more. I like that. But sometimes he makes some physical throws. Like, there are a lot of throws where he's throwing to a guy that's open and he just biffs it. Like, he sky mails it, man. Yeah. There was one pick against the Dolphins, I believe it was this year, where he's trying to throw to Ricky Pearsall over the middle of the field. There's no pressure in his face, clean pocket, nothing. And he just sky mails it right into the defender's hands. And I'm like, what the hell is that? Like, how do you have that little control over where the football goes? So that's where I worry about Brock Purdy, frankly. But there is a lot to like there. They're clearly going to pay him. Now my thing is, make sure that that ish is wrapped up before the new league year starts, so you know exactly what you have, exactly what you can spend, and there's no freaking drama over the summer. I want none of that.
And if you look at quarterbacks throughout the years in their second season starting, like as a full-time starter, I went and looked. Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, CJ Stroud, Dak Prescott, to name a few, they all had kind of rough years in their second full year starting. If you go back and look, even Dak, I know a lot of people don't love him, but statistically, he's had a lot of good seasons, and he did not statistically in his second full year as a starter. And Brock could be there too. He's still a young, really young quarterback. A lot of injuries around him. He had the arm issue. You know, the league is catching up. He's got to adjust too. We'll see if he can do that in year 3, but it's not crazy with quarterback in his second year to have a sophomore slump, the second full year starting, I should say, to have a sophomore slump. So it could have been part of that too. We'll see. We're not going to know until he gets out there and we see what he can do in his third full year. But I agree with you. I just think it's the right move. Kyle likes him. He knows the offense. He's a good player. If he can get rid of those bonehead interceptions, the elements may just be what they're going to be. He just may be a bad weather quarterback. But I think it's the right move to sign him. It's going to happen, and we'll see where we go. The issue is not Brock Purdy. The issue is them filling in everywhere else to make this a good overall team. Because right now they have a lot of great players, but would I call this good team? I wouldn't. So.
Right. I think on the list of 49ers issues, Brock Purdy is not number 1, not number 2. He's not number 3. Like, he's way down the list. I would agree with you there. If you had told me that he was only going to throw 20 touchdowns in 15 games this year, I would have been like, well, I hope he's got a lot of quarterback sneaks, because that ain't good enough. I mean, in 2023, he threw 31 touchdowns. That was we had not had a 49ers quarterback get to 30 touchdowns since Jeff Garcia was the quarterback of this team. And a lot of people listening and watching to this don't even remember Jeff Garcia as a 49ers quarterback. That's how long ago it was. That was really the level that I thought that he was going to be able to consistently perform at. And he absolutely did not. And I know there were mitigating circumstances with Ayuk and McCaffrey and all that stuff. Yeah. But you got to do better than 20 touchdowns. If Brock goes into this year and throws 20 touchdowns next year, that's a disaster for the Niners.
Yeah, and you look at they weren't a good red zone team this year, and maybe the injuries had a lot to do with that. And they didn't. 2023, they had a lot of 20-plus yard TDs. They had a lot of big plays, and I'd have to go back and look, but they maybe had 3 or 4 this year. So they weren't getting those big plays, those big throws. Did it have something to do with his arm? Maybe. I think it had more to do with that they didn't have Brandon Ayuk, who's their deep threat, who's a guy who would stretch the field, who's a guy who could threaten defenses deep. So everything was kind of in a box with them, because Juwan Jennings had a great year, but Juwan Jennings runs like, what, a 4.8? I mean, he had a great season, but he's not going to threaten the defense. Deebo is not going to threaten the defense. They didn't have anybody like that. And Ayuk was their guy for that. Even though Ayuk, when he was in, he didn't have a great statistical season, he still brought that threat to them. So I think those two things had a lot to do with it as well. But yeah, like you said, it's something that has to get fixed as they move forward. He can't throw 20 TDs again. He's got to be a little bit more prolific in that regard. Now, he did throw for a lot of yards. He had 3,800. If he doesn't get hurt, he's going to get 4,000 again. So he did that for sure. But we'll see. There's a lot with Purdy. People can have their opinions and think what they want to. The bottom line is we have to see what happens over the next year or two.
And I think some of the issues with the offense, especially in the red zone, like, go back 2021, when they got to that like 25-yard line, 20-yard line, they would get Deebo on a handoff or an end around. And a lot of times he would solve their problem, where they would just give it to Deebo and he would score a touchdown.
Yep.
And if that just stopped happening, the running game with Deebo really dropped off. And that's why I'm really interested to see what the offense looks like with him off the team. Because I think a lot of times Kyle would just default to, well, we'll do a screen pass to Deebo or hand off to Deebo. He'll break 3 tackles, and that'll be our red zone play. And it's like, I got to see more creativity from that. I want to see some different things. I want to see what the offense looks like when Kyle doesn't have this crutch, frankly. And I think they could be a lot more successful in the red zone next year, because they don't just say, well, we got to get it to Deebo and waste one of the 3 downs in the red zone. And by the way, we know it's only going to be 3 downs because Kyle doesn't go for it on 4th.
Yeah, even with McCaffrey too, I feel like, Kyle's had some issues in the red zone, but he kind of had, you mentioned Deebo and McCaffrey. They had 2 studs in there that can, make up for a lot of other issues. Kittle was terrific this year down there, but yeah, the Niners have to, as they get into this offense with Purdy, they have to put people around him to help support him, right? They have to get better in the interior of their offensive line because he's not a big quarterback. They have to get more speed because he doesn't have a cannon arm, but he is good throwing the ball deep. He has good numbers. He is accurate and all those things. So get somebody who can stretch the field as well to help with that stuff. So yeah, we'll see. Kyle, as good as a play caller as Kyle can be and scheming and everything like that, sometimes he drives me a little bit crazy with his decisions and the things that he's running, especially in the red zone. I do wish he would. Do you remember the game? It was against the Saints. It had to be 2019 when they're doing the handoff. Was it the handoff to Mostert? He's pitching to Juszczyk, or it was the other way around.
Yes.
And Emmanuel Sanders is throwing the ball. And I'm like, this is the Kyle Shanahan I thought I was getting. Like, oh, this is great. I can't wait to see how this evolves over the next years. And then he just doesn't ever do anything like that. I feel like he's he's set in his ways. He seems like a stubborn guy, right? Like, this is my offense. This is what I want to run. I wish he would get a little bit more creative. I wish he would think outside the box a little bit more. Hopefully with Salah running the defense, they have this new special teams coordinator now. Maybe that can get a little bit better. I think where Kyle drives me a little bit crazy sometimes when people say, well, Kyle called a good game today. I always say to myself, Kyle's the head coach, dude. He's not. Yeah, he called a good game, but the special teams played like shit. And the defense didn't play well. He's the head coach. He's the CEO. So maybe with these other guys, he could be a little bit more CEO-y. The offense he can be a little more creative with the offense. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, there's things that they have to fix in that regard.
It is frustrating that Kyle's solution to fixing some of the other aspects on the team is well, I'll just hire a really good defensive coordinator and he'll handle everything. And it's sometimes you got to step in yourself and deal with it. Because I agree, you can't just judge Kyle as an offensive coordinator because he's not. He is the head coach. That's a different job. So it all ultimately does fall to him. I was just thinking back. We did see that flea flicker against the Cowboys in 2023. Remember, that was one of Kittle's touchdowns came.
Yes. Okay. Yep.
Deebo, he flipped it back to Brock. We've seen that. We saw the pass from Jawan Jennings in the Super Bowl this past, against the Chiefs. Their first touchdown came on a trick play like that. I think that Kyle, when people say they want the offense to evolve a little bit, I don't know that they really know what they mean. I feel like people say that, but they don't say how they want it to evolve. Do you want them to use 4 wide receivers more? Do you want them to get rid of Kyle Juszczyk and not use a fullback anymore? What specifically do you think people mean when they say we want the offense to evolve?
Well, yeah, I think I don't know that they don't want Kyle Juszczyk, but yeah, like you said, maybe some more 4 receivers. Maybe some more 4 receiver sets. Just different kind of, like you said, not that you always want to use gimmicky stuff, but here and there, just something to throw the defense off. I do think once Purdy came in there, they were scoring so many points, because of McCaffrey and all those things, but it was the big plays. All of a sudden they had a guy, he doesn't have Justin Herbert's arm, but he was not afraid to rip it. He was not afraid to throw the ball downfield. And that opened so many things up for the offense and also the off schedule things. Purdy, which you didn't see with Garoppolo and what they hoped they were getting with Lance. And it's funny that they got it with Purdy. Look at how much he can move around and do things off schedule. That helped open the offense. So I don't know that the offense opened up because anything different that Kyle was doing. He just had a guy who was willing to take a chance and also run around and be able to make things happen. How many times do we see Purdy run around and throw the ball 30 yards downfield? We never saw anything like that. But I do want to come back to Kyle. I will say this. Early, the first half of the career, he had Robert Saleh, who was a head coach, McDaniel, who was a head coach, D'Amico Ryans, who became a head coach. He hired 3 dudes who became head coaches. I mean, you can't do much better than that. But what has happened in the past couple of years is, okay, Ryans moves on, hires Steve Wilkes. Doesn't work. And he was made a scapegoat, right or wrong. He was pretty much made a scapegoat. You move on. You move on from him. You hire Nick Sorensen and bring in Brandon Staley. It's a disaster. So now, after you have this reputation of, listen, my man can hire coaches. He's got all these head coaches in the league. You have one coach that it didn't work. I don't want to. Wilkes wasn't a disaster. It just didn't work for various reasons. Sorensen was a disaster. The only move I feel like was Robert Saleh, because if he hires somebody else and they don't work out, you're like, all right, dude. Okay, you're 3 in a row, man. But with Salah, it's already worked. You became a head coach of it. So if something happens, it's likely not Salah. And that's why I feel like they put all their eggs in the Salah basket, because it was like, he was kind of like, I can't screw up again. I can't do it.
Here's the weird thing about the Wilks situation. The only reason we're like using Wilks as a strike against Kyle is because Kyle fired him. If Kyle doesn't fire Steve Wilks, you would look at that and say, well, they were third in the entire NFL in points allowed per game and eighth in yards allowed per game. No, who looks at that as, performance from a defensive coordinator and says that's a fireable offense?
Right.
The only reason we're saying Steve Wilks counts as a strike against you is because they fired him. Now I get it. It didn't mesh or whatever, but like his actual performance on the field was not nearly as bad as people think. It wasn't Nick Sorensen, right? Just because they both got fired. Sorensen was a disaster. And it tells me that things with Wilks must have been really bad behind the scenes, because they knew they were going to have no defensive coordinators to choose from when they fired Wilks, because the whole hiring cycle had already happened because the Niners were still playing, and they fired him anyway. Yeah. So that tells me it had to be really bad.
And with Wilks too, there were moments that stuck out. The play against Minnesota at the end of the half, what happened at the end of the Super Bowl, but the defense also played terrific for the first part of the half of the Super Bowl or whatever it was. So yeah, I think it wasn't meshing, whatever was a personality thing or whatever it was, it didn't mesh. And like you said, yeah, they could have said, all right, we're going to give him one more year. And if it doesn't work, we're going to move on.
Yes.
But they didn't. They fired him, like I said, with really no options. You're going after pipe dreams like Bill Belichick and Steve Spagnuolo. It wasn't happening. You bring him in. You bring in Sorensen. I guess they brought in Staley to help with Sorensen. That's the only. I mean, come on. What are we saying if they didn't do that? Right?
Babysitter.
It blows up in their face. He had to get the right pick this year. And Salah's out there, and he was already the right pick. So it's 100% safe for him. So I feel like that's what he had to do. But I feel like, Kyle had criticism, but this is after the season. I feel like he's not on the hot seat. If he has a bad year this year, he'll be on the hot seat. But I feel like this year was the first year where there was a little bit of a crack. He's going to get criticism, but there was never really, he was still very Teflon because he won so much. But this is the first year where there's a crack where if it doesn't go well this year, well, now we're pointing back to these drafts that didn't work. And now we're bringing up the contracts, because when you don't win, all the stuff that is kind of chaotic or dysfunctional, now it comes to light. Even the stuff he's done with the quarterbacks, it's been a little weird, right? Like with Garoppolo practicing on the side field, and we're going to bring Lance back and we're bringing Darnold in. And it was just just the Lance trade in general. It's all been a little weird, but you win. So who cares? You found Purdy. So who cares? But now when you don't win, they're like, oh, hey, you remember that? Do you remember when Garoppolo was on the side field? That was weird, right? And now this stuff compounds a little bit.
It's weird. Sometimes they remind me of like a golfer that's good at recovery shots, right? Like, boom, you tee off, you hit the ball like next to a tree root, terrible tee shot. You bounce off the cart path, you're near a tree root. But then you take out your like 7-iron and you do like a half swing punch out, and all of a sudden it goes on the green, right? Like the Trey Lance thing, debacle. Yet they trade him for a 4th round pick.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're going to get more for Trey Lance than they're going to get for Deebo Samuel. Think about that.
Seriously.
And then the 4th round pick that they take is Malik Mustafa, who may end up being a starting safety for them. So it's like their recovery shot after the Lance debacle was crazy, not to mention obviously ending up with Brock Purdy as well.
Yeah.
So like, it's just a wild, bizarre situation sometimes how they're able to navigate in and out of these crazy things. And they got to do a little navigating now, because you're right. There are some cracks that are showing. All the stuff that people kind of let slide because they were winning so much. Well, when you're not winning, it's like people have the list and they just bring out the receipts and they're like, well, remember this, this, and this. You screwed up this and you didn't do that. And so that's where they are now. And if they win again and go back to a conference championship game again, nobody's going to say anything.
Yeah, and that's the business. But it's crazy when you look at that Lance trade. That's one of the worst trades in the history of football, and it didn't matter at the time. It's starting to show up now because of the roster and things like that. But it got brushed under the rug. They were like, we got Purdy, it's fine. That almost no one survives that, a trade like that. It was crazy. Because
usually when you make that trade and it fails the way it did, you lose games.
Yeah,
but
and it just didn't matter. Winning. It was crazy.
They made the conference championship game every single year of the draft picks that were gone. So it was a bizarre situation. People talk about the Lance trade, and it did hurt the depth, but they also gave up 4 picks for Christian McCaffrey. They gave up a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth for Christian McCaffrey. The combination of giving up so many draft picks, not getting as much in return for those picks as you would have hoped, and the picks that they did make, stinking a lot of them. That's why the roster, the talent has just eroded from this roster. Now, in this year's draft, if you can get one very good player, right? Whoever you take, let's assume it would be most likely in the first round. If you get one very good player at 11, and you can get 2 to 3 average NFL players, I think that's a solid draft. And I think that's a reasonable expectation for what to get out of this draft class. If you get more, great, of course. But like to say like, well, you got to do exactly what you did in 2024. I think that would be a high expectation, frankly, for me.
Yeah. The last really good draft that they had was 2020, and it was the Kinlaw draft, but they got Ayuk, they got Jennings, they got McKivitz out of that draft, I believe, who's starting right tackle for them in the 5th round. They had some really good picks there. And then after that, it's been a little bit rough. And I feel at times they drafted like, hey, we need a safety. Let's take Jair Brown. Hey, we need a kicker. Let's take Jake Moody. Well, we could use a tight end. Let's take Latu. And you're not maybe taking the best player available. It's interesting. I saw Mayoko had in one of his mocks, he had Tyler Warren going at 11. A lot of people were like, so you have that reaction too. But I thought about it and like, if they think he's a blue chip dude, they need blue chip dudes. I mean, I'd have to really sit and think about that if that happened, but they need a lot of talent. They do need defensive line. I do need these things, but they also need best player available. So I think they have gotten themselves in trouble where they've said, hey, we need this position. Let's draft it, as opposed to saying, all right, let's just take the best dude here, the best guy here. So we'll see what their approach is going to be this year, because obviously they need defensive line. This is a good defensive line class. It's just sitting there in 11 and I don't know, Walter Nolan or somebody like that is there. And they're like, all right, this is what we need. We're going to take him. But are you going to take him who could be a good player? And then you have an all pro sitting there at Warren. Where's your head at type thing. So it'd be interesting to see what they do and what their approach is with it.
I think that some people, when they look at this, especially in the immediate aftermath of a draft, they sort of assume that all the players are at the same skill level, right? That was like when the 49ers took Pearsall in round 1 last year, was like, how can you take Ricky Pearsall? How can you take a wide receiver when you had other offensive linemen that were there? Roger Rosengarten, all these guys. Kingsley Suamataia, right? Everybody wanted the 49ers to, how could you let the Chiefs get him? Well, guess what? He sucks. He got benched by the Chiefs like immediately. Yeah. But right after the draft, people judge it as a mistake because they assume that all these guys are at the same skill level and that the 49ers just chose the wrong position. Obviously, that's not how the 49ers evaluate it. But if you're telling me at 11, they go Tyler Warren because they look at the offensive lineman and the defensive lineman that are there and they're like, he's a way better tight end, H-back, whatever, than the offensive linemen that were there. Okay, but I find it hard to believe that out of all the offensive linemen and all the defensive linemen that are going to be available at that spot, that he's that much better than them. So please don't go for the shiny new toy. Please.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what they do. I'm as excited about this offseason as I have in a while, just because they're at a crossroads and you're almost remaking the team on the fly a little bit right now because you have so many free agents and because you have so many needs. So we've seen them build it up and then we've seen them make some mistakes that have put them in a position to have to build it up again. But it is 8 years later. I mean, it's not like it was 2 years and everything went to shit. Like it is 8 years later. So I'm really interested to see how this regime builds it up again. I'm looking forward to the next couple of months.
Can I just real quick gripe about something? And this is like first world problems. The fact that the 49ers have the 11th pick in the first round and all these draft graphics that get tweeted out are only the top 10 picks. Do you know how frustrating it is to check every single one and be like, oh, nope, stops at 10. Nope, stops at 10. It's infuriating. Don't get the 10th or the 11th pick in the draft, anybody. Either get 10 or screw it. Like it's so maddening.
We'll see, man. We'll see what they do. I want to say I'm kind of optimistic. They're just due for a good offseason, I feel like. So we'll see what, especially if there's pressure from ownership right now, we'll see what it's all about. I just hope that they don't do a lot of Band-Aids again. I hope they don't try to band-aid it and say, hey, let's try to squeeze one more year out of this, because then you're going to have a lot of problems. I want them to look more towards the future with the free agent signings and of course the draft. But
would you consider a Max Crosby trade a band-aid?
No, but where I worry about with and this is going to sound crazy because you're talking about Crosby or Garrett because they're awesome. But where I worry about that is if you do that and you give up more draft capital and you have another huge contract, are you in a similar position to where you were, where you have these 5 or 6 awesome players and then the rest of your team kind of is mid?
Yep.
That's where I worry a little bit. So would it be great to have Max Crosby? Absolutely. But what are you giving up? What does it do financially with these other guys? Because Bosa's making quarterback money on the other side, man. Warner makes a ton of money. Williams makes a ton of Ayuk. These guys have big contracts. You're about to pay Purdy. Is that going to hurt your team more? Especially if one of these guys goes down, then you have like nothing and you're really struggling. So I don't know, man. Would I love to have Max Crosby? Absolutely. But I think this team has so many needs. They cannot bring in a guy like that if it's going to hurt them building for the future, because they do need so much.
Would you support signing Joey Bosa, who is rumored to be getting cut by the Chargers? Would you sign Joey Bosa, who's not going to cost you any draft picks?
Yeah, I think as a short-term piece, that's okay if you do that here and there. You're not going to go into every position and have 5 to 10 year solutions. You're going to need band-aids here and there, role players here and there. Look what they did when they had, Armstead and Bosa as your foundation, and you bring in a Menahue and an Ibukam and guys like that, Arden Key, like that worked when you bring in those role players, when you have those foundational pieces. So let's say, for example, you have Nick Bosa, you draft a foundational defensive tackle at 11, and you bring in Joey Bosa to come in and be like a role player band-aid type thing for a year or two. I like something like that. If you think you're going to bring in Joey Bosa and then you're going to ignore the defensive line in the draft or whatever else, that I have an issue with, because all you did was put a Band-Aid on the problem.
Yes, I agree. If Joey Bosa is just a piece of a retooled defensive line, great. I'm all for it. If you think, oh, great, we got Joey Bosa, our work is done, you're going to be in for a very, very rude awakening. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll keep an eye on everything happening with the 49ers. Again, the Combine kicks off next week, so there will be plenty of juicy rumors for us to talk about, and I cannot wait to do it. Al, thank you so much for jumping in here. I really appreciate it. It was, really short notice, so thank you for hopping on.
Anytime, man.
If you want to follow Al, you can check him out on X at AlSacco49. Definitely go and give him a follow. I promise you will be a better, smarter fan. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday, everybody, and we'll talk tomorrow.